We're celebrating 4th of July weekend. You know, we're celebrating the declaration of our independence from Great Britain, from England. This country was originally founded by some settlers, some folks who came over on the Mayflower, among others. They came over and began a form of self-government, but still under British rule for quite some time. Finally came to a head of oppression and a number of issues. And on July the 4th, 1776, a group of men, our founding fathers, came together and penned and signed a document unlike anything before it in history, declaring themselves to be free of British rule, declaring these United States of America to be a sovereign nation. And that's what we're celebrating this weekend, this nation. And it's fitting and good for us to do so. It's very fitting for us to celebrate God's goodness here. And God has been good to you. Whoever you are today, if you can hear my voice, especially if you're hearing my voice here in these United States, whether you are black or white or Asian or Native American or Hispanic or any other label that I haven't thought to mention, God has been good to you. Because the thief cometh not but for to kill, to steal, and destroy. Jesus said, I have come that you might have life. You might have it more abundantly. The devil had a plan for you today. And if you're hearing this, his plan has not been accomplished, and God has been good to you. He's been so good to these United States of America that we should celebrate. We have 4.5% of the people in the world, 60% of the world reserve currencies of the world are United States dollars. We control so much of the wealth of the world. There are no other nations that live like us. It's something to celebrate. I've heard a lot of people say this year, I hear some of it every year, but this year I've heard a lot of people say that we should not be celebrating the 4th of July this year because of all of the divisions in this country, all of the social unrest, all of the history of racism, the history of slavery, the history of all these things, the history of civil rights oppressions. Some people think that it's somehow something that only white people would want to celebrate. Only certain cultures, only certain factions of our society that have really been blessed by these United States. That somehow the history of slavery and racial discrimination should cause people to despise our heritage, our history, and our nation. Why, I've heard even some of my Christian ministry friends, and they are my friends, not my enemies, I've heard them say things and publish statements on Facebook and other places like that America is founded on a bad foundation, that the United States is founded on a foundation of stolen land, a foundation of slavery and racial oppression, and that because of that this nation isn't something that we should celebrate. And it makes me sad to hear those type of things, and it makes me sad to read those type of things. Sad for our nation, and sad for the people who are making such statements. I believe that they are gross distortions of the truth, and perhaps even an offense to God himself. This nation that we live in is still the greatest nation on earth, even with all of our problems, and even with our history and all of the junk. Now, I want to get into the Word in a minute. We're going to talk about the Word in John chapter 8. But it's fitting that we should address this in the context of worshiping God and being faithful to Him. It's fitting and godly that we should discuss this today. The things that people point to as a reason to be ungrateful for God's greatness here in the United States are actually the reasons to celebrate if people would just look a little deeper at the story. We should celebrate all of the good that we have to share together in this great land. Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Native American. First, let's consider that foundation that my friend was talking about on Facebook. Let's consider that foundation that so many people today say is flawed. This country's foundation goes back to the Mayflower. It goes back to a group of 102 men and women that came across, half of whom died the first year, came across in terrible conditions. They came across for religious freedom. They were looking to worship God. And this group of people came together and they penned a document called the Mayflower Compact, something that was unique in history that became, they could never have known what was going to grow out of that, out of this little group, but they came together and they made this agreement to govern themselves, to join together and govern themselves through this democratic process. And in that little document, they began with the first sentence that declared their purpose. And they declared that their purpose was for the glory of God and the furtherance of Christianity. That is not a bad foundation. That is a good foundation. That is a wonderful foundation, and God has so blessed that foundation, my friends. This agreement of self-government, this purpose of serving God and worshiping Him, this self-governance agreement wherein they each had a voice. And this idea grew into the principles that led to our other founding documents. This idea, this thing grew into the principles that led to the document that we celebrate the signing of this weekend, the Declaration of Independence of these United States of America. And let's look at that declaration because it is a foundational document. And in that document, they declared that all men are created, and yes, it says boldly that men are created, not evolved, not planted by aliens, that all men are created equal, and that all people, all men, are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights that cannot be taken away. It said in that document that all men are created equal. All men, not all white men, not all fair-colored skinned men, all men. And let me tell you, folks, they knew what they were writing when they wrote it. They knew what was going to come from daring to put those words. All men are created equal. There was a lot of debate. It wasn't like, oh, we forgot to put white in there. There was a lot of debate back then about, there was some folks that wanted to say, we need to put white men in here. People are going to come later and they're going to say that the Negroes are somehow included in this. There was some debate about that, and they wrote it anyway. They wrote it the way they wrote it because it is what it meant. They wrote it anyway because that was the only way that they could get the agreement to come together to stand up against the master that was enslaving them. They had to come together and acknowledge that all men were created equal. They knew that if this thing worked out, if they did end up having a nation and not all dead, if they did end up free from British rule, they knew that those words were going to come back just a few years down the road in a mighty way, that those words would lead to something like the abolitionist movement that happened as a result of, in part as a result of those. They knew that those words were going to come back and challenge the very idea of slavery that so many of the states were sold on, the very idea of these racist boundaries, and yet they wrote them anyway. This is the foundation that this nation was founded on, and it's a good foundation. That document is a good document. The people that began the abolitionist movement to end slavery relied on that document. They looked back to the foundation and they said, this is our foundation. And slavery doesn't fit on it. Martin Luther King Jr. referred to those foundational documents. He persuaded people to realize that there was some junk built on the foundation that didn't go. Slavery, by the way, existed all over the world in 1776, not just here. But the document that was used to found this nation was a solid foundation upon which others built an abolition movement. And by the way, they were white people. They were white people that wrote that document, and they were white people that built the abolitionist movement, building on an amazing foundation of goodness, truth, and justice. Now, yes, there were and are a great many problems and evils in America, then and now. But they were not there because America was bad. They're there because men are bad. The problems that exist in this country do not exist because we have a bad foundation. They exist because we have bad hearts. And that is a condition common to all men apart from Jesus Christ. Not just here in America. And a document called the Declaration of Independence or the United States Constitution or the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or any other document you can ever come up with will not change the condition of men's hearts. People have tried to do that by law for thousands of years, and it does not work. Only the Spirit of God through faith can change the condition of men's hearts. Men are bad. What about the accusation that this American land was stolen? Yes, it is true that many of the Indians were treated very unfairly. Many of the Native Americans treated very, very unfairly. That is true. And it's also true that many of those Native Americans were treating each other even more unfairly before any white settlers got here. Long before. It is true of the Aztec nations, the Aztec Indians. It is true that they were responsible for more human sacrifices than any other civilization in history that I'm aware of. Well, there's one recorded event in Aztec history from before the white settlers came where they sacrificed to their sun gods thousands and thousands of people in just one day, taking them to a cliff and killing them for no other reason than to satisfy their idolatry. Children, young ladies, virgins, slaughtered. There was a lot of trouble before we got here. It's also true that there is no land on this planet that wasn't inhabited by somebody before somebody else inhabited it. Look at all the nations and regimes that have changed hands in Europe, from one regime to another, from one nation to another. Europe, Asia, Africa, one people conquering another, if the fact that one person or one government displaced another is what makes something bad, then the whole planet's bad. And by the way, it is. God's got a solution for that. Jesus is coming back to set things straight, but that is another sermon for another day. Yeah, it's true. But it was God that gave the land to Israel. It was God that gave the land of Israel to Abram and to his descendants, and he sent Moses and Joshua to thrust out the people that were living there. If that in itself is evil, then you would have to argue that God is evil, and let's not do that today. God said, by the way, that this was not because Israel was so good, but it was because those people were so evil. They were doing the same kinds of things there that the Aztec Indians were doing, and so many others were doing, as they were worshiping false gods and false idols and killing their own children as sacrifices to them, as they would pass their children through the fire to Moloch. That meant they burnt them alive to offer to their gods, and they did so many evils, and God said that it offended him so much that he decided to drive them out of the land and give that land to the nation of Israel. And then he told them something that we should all hear today, because he said we needed to know that so that we don't become evil like them, because if we do, he will cause the land to vomit us out also. Don't be high-minded here in these great United States, because God is able to bring it to nothing in a moment. And he will. When Jesus comes back, he's not coming back to establish the United States as the head of the world. He will come back and annihilate forever the whole idea of the United States. It will be one world king, King Jesus. But for today, I'm celebrating the United States because it is still by far, and I mean by far, the best, the very best that this planet has to offer as far as countries to live in, places to be, I believe. Let me go on a little bit. So it was God that drove them out in Israel. He told us to take heed. So yes, it is true that many Native Americans were displaced. They were not allowed to leave the land undeveloped and bare, which is what they insisted on doing. They were not allowed to prevent the development of this nation any more than the people who owned homes down in the North Street, Plum Street area where the hospital is now were allowed to keep their homes. Those white people that had homes for many years when they needed to build a hospital. The cause of development for the whole people, the whole government is considered, and that's the price of growing a great civilization that is able to feed so many, that is able to help so many, that is able to save so many, that is able to defend so many. That sometimes is the cost of it. So yeah, I suppose the idea was, and what they wanted then was to all the land not to be built on and not to be developed, and these whole United States just become a great wasteland. And let me tell you what would have happened if the United States had agreed to that. Then somebody else would have come in and conquered it, like China or Russia or France or Spain, because they all had their parts too. Or somebody from the north or somebody from the south. It was going to be developed. Thank God it was developed on this foundation called the Declaration of Independence. Thank God it was developed on a foundation that declares that all men are created equal. I hope I'm not offending anyone. It's supposed to be a history lesson about God's providence here in this country and why we should celebrate today. and this weekend. So yes, that may be the price of having a great civilization. But I want to tell you about this. Even though it's true that a lot of Native Americans were displaced, they were forced to allow the development of this nation, of this country. Even though it's true that that was forced, they were also allowed to participate in it. And that, my friends, is an incredible difference in so many places of the world. That separates this country from so many places. Yeah, they were forced to allow the land to be built on, but they're also allowed to become full citizens of it. They're allowed to become citizens of this nation, as many of my own ancestors have. I don't have any ancestors that owned slaves. I don't have any ancestors that were part of that. All my ancestors came over either from Europe in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, or they were already here. Some of my ancestors are Cherokee Indians. My great-grandfather on my mother's side came over when he was 13 from Italy on a boat by himself because there was poverty and famine in his land, and there were no opportunities. And so he came here where he found opportunity. On my father's side, and I think that was in the early 1900s when my great-grandfather Menzelli came over. My father's side, it was in the late 1800s. I think they came over. My father's side, I think it was my great-grandfather something, married an Indian woman. My grandmother's name, her maiden name was Roundtree, which is an Indian name. And my great-grandmother's maiden name was Meadows, also an Indian name. And you know, I'm thankful that they chose to become part of this society. I'm so thankful that my grandmother and great-grandmother had chosen to become part of this United States society. I'm thankful that I wasn't born on a reservation somewhere, and even more thankful that I wasn't born in a teepee in an open plain without civilization at all. I'm so thankful for these United States and the blessings that I've enjoyed here. Because of the great foundation that we've built this nation on, there is not a different level of citizenship for one race than there is for another. And yes, I know that because of the condition of the hearts of men, there's still a lot of people that act that way. I'm not ignoring those problems. We're talking about the foundation and the country that we live in. Because those problems are common to all men everywhere. They're not caused by the Constitution of the United States. They're not caused by the Declaration of Independence. They're not caused by this great nation that was built on a foundation of faith in God. They're caused by the sinfulness of men's hearts. And we're not going to solve that with another set of laws or a protest. What we need to do to solve that is get back to the foundation of godliness that the country was built on, because that's the foundation that brought any good change that ever came. As we fixed those problems one by one, the ones that were fixed because of the faith and goodness of people who were serving Jesus. So we have this great foundation. Even today, the Indians, the Native Americans who've chosen to stay on reservations, they have the benefits of sovereignty there while still holding the benefits of citizenship here. So, no, I do not believe the accusation of stolen land is appropriate. I rather believe that it was the divine providence of God that led us to this land and to his bountiful blessings in it. So what of the outcome? I'm just about to get into the word here, but let's talk about the conclusion now of the thing. What of the outcome? In criticizing a thing, you ought to consider the alternatives as well. As I said, the alternative to my ancestors coming here from Europe, seeking opportunities, and the alternative to those choosing to leave the reservations, their alternatives weren't so good. My great-grandfather had stayed in Italy, he'd probably have starved to death. Who knows how bad things could have got? There was famine in Europe. Places like Ireland and Italy, children were dying in the streets. And there were great troubles all over the world. All millions and millions of people immigrated from China as they were building the railroads here. And yes, they were treated with a great deal of prejudice. They were mistreated. There was a lot of evil. They weren't mistreated because our foundation was bad. They were mistreated because there were so many prejudiced people, so many people filled with sin in their hearts that did evil. And because of that foundation, eventually things were done that were good to alleviate some of that. But they came anyway. They came knowing that because guess what? Even with all of that junk, it was still better than where they were coming from. They were being oppressed more in China than they were here. They were being treated even worse by the emperor and the regime there. The famine, the poverty was even worse. Great troubles were in China that caused the Chinese to migrate. Many Native Americans became very, very happy with their lives here in this society. But I want to tell you something. Before there was these United States, the Crow and the Apache and the Sioux and so many others murderously and savagely slaughtered one another regularly. They often had wars among themselves, and without any law and without any standard, without any order, without any limits to what they would do, without justice at all. It was a Darwinian society of whoever was strong enough to destroy the other, who was able to inflict enough harm was the victor. They often offered no consolation to the losers, often scalping women and children. Those things happened long before there were white settlers here. It was not some grand utopian place where the buffalo roamed and they all lived in wonderful harmony. It was a pretty violent, rough, rugged, scary place to be. And I'm glad I wasn't born into it. And I'd say that if I was all Native American and not just part, I believe. And even in Africa, there's some pretty terrible problems happening in Africa even today. Even today. As I read about the child soldiers that are forced to kill even their own families in places like Sudan and Uganda, that's going on today, this century, my lifetime, children. As I read about a little 12-year-old girl that she said something that the people in power didn't like, and they cut her lips off. She ended up dying, but they did that to her. As I read about the Sharia law being imposed on people in Sudan, where they have the death penalty just for considering a change of their religious beliefs. I read just today, just this morning, just yesterday, 166 people were killed in Ethiopia because they were protesting the murder of a popular singer. And so they went to have a protest like we do here. And the government came in with their police and they opened fire and killed 166 people. That's what they do with protesters in Ethiopia. That's how much, God help me for saying it, but that's how much Black Lives Matter there. And thank God that we're able to have Black Lives Matter, because they do, and people should listen. There are some issues that need to be considered. But let's not go so far as to despise our heritage, which is good, and our nation, which is good, and the blessings that God has given us, which is good. I won't despise it because he might take it away. Instead, let's be thankful for what we have as we reach on for more and expect God for more. Let's fix the problems that are there without despising what is good. Just yesterday, 166 people. You know, I thank God that my wife's family was born here in America, even with all the tragedy that it took to get there. Now, I've got some bias for thinking that, because otherwise I'd have never known her, and she's pretty special. So, but I thank God. You see, the Bible says that God has a way of making all things work together for good to those that love God. Well, people might have got there the wrong way. Consider Joseph in the Bible, who was sold into slavery in Egypt. And look what God did with that. If we'll just put our trust in him, you will be amazed at what God can do. Yes, we've had a terrible problem of racial bigotry and prejudice and hate in this country. But that's not because America's bad. That's because men are bad. This great foundation that this country was built on is what causes men to change those evils and to challenge them. And it's what gives men the right to step up and protest when they see something wrong, and do it in the confidence that they're not going to be shot dead, as they do in China. Tanks running over people that protest the government. It is this great foundation and the godly character of this nation that brought about, again, I'll say, the abolition of slavery. At great cost to white people, by the way. Greater cost to white people than anything else in the history of this nation. Over 1 million lives were lost in the Civil War. And I think that we as a nation and people and history have concluded that it was worth it, if that was the only way to stop the terror, the evil that was happening. And it's the foundation that brought that about, that brought about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that compelled white people to march with Martin Luther King Jr. There are no other nations that don't also face issues with bigotry and hatred and prejudice. There are no other nations that I know of that don't have the same kind of issues, but most of them are a lot worse because they don't have the ability, the foundation that gives us the right to protest and to change. They're not built on that. Have you heard of the caste system in India? Although it's been outlawed for decades, it's still practiced across the country. You want to talk about prejudice and bigotry. This thing stood for thousands of years as the law. They've only relatively recently outlawed it, but they haven't stopped it. Have you heard of the Dalits in India? They're the untouchables at the bottom of this system. They're called untouchable. They can't get jobs because they're not, because of their birth, because they were born into that caste. They're only fit to be beggars. They're not even fit to be servants. They're not allowed to even be servants if you're in that caste. They're the beggars on the street because it is the belief of their system, their Hinduish system, that they must have done something terrible in a previous life and now they're being punished, and we would be interfering with the gods if we did anything good for them, and then it only caused them to be punished more in another lifetime. They have to pay for that and be suffered. There are 300 million of these Dalits in India. 300 million, almost the entire population of this country. It's pretty bad in some other places, friends. That's what I'm trying to say. You heard about the things going on in China right now? They don't have protests over there. Let me tell you. They started to have a little of that in Hong Kong, and that's the only reason they even started to have it is because Hong Kong was still under British rule up until the end of the last century, and so they have a lot of people there. Most of their population there was born and raised under a system much more like our democracy, where they might have thought and got used to the idea that they had a right to protest. But they stopped that. Or have you heard of Sharia law? A third of the world, or something like that, not a third, but something like 1 billion people are Muslims now, and so many countries are taking on these Sharia law. You want to talk about, my God, you want to talk about oppression and prejudice? If you're not a Muslim, you don't have any rights. If you convert to Christianity, you can be killed or convert to another religion. I think the result here in America has been pretty good, if you compare it. Yeah, we still got a lot of problems. So many other nations are filled with like evils because, according to the Bible, the imagination of men's hearts is continually evil. In fact, the Bible tells us clearly that all have turned aside. There is none righteous. No, not one. Every single person on this planet has in them something that wants to do evil, something that is capable of so much wickedness and so much evil. All have turned aside, all have gone out of the way. Yet here we are, in this place where we have such a foundation of godliness and justice that good men are still able to challenge evil publicly, at least for now. Change still comes. And because of this great foundation, and godly men still can prevail to do good, at least for now. Jesus said, you got to work now. You got to work while there is light, because the darkness is coming. The Antichrist system is coming. The time will come when we can't do good anymore, when we can't build on unity and love anymore. So we should celebrate the great gift that God has given us here in this United States. Yes, I'll still stand for the national anthem. And while I'm standing, I will still respect the right and dignity of anyone that wants to kneel. That's also part of the foundation. And I know there's a lot of people that don't respect that. But they can't look to the law and find an excuse for that. They have to look to the condition of their heart. That's my point, folks. The problem is in men's hearts, not the law, not our foundation, not this great blessing that God has given us. So we've got to rejoice and thank God for the good that he's given us. Yeah, I'll still stand. I still love the idea of freedom that we're founded on. And I look to those very ideas as the basis to challenge racism, to challenge oppression, and to challenge all injustice. God bless the United States. Because here we still have freedom. Freedom is one of these great blessings that God has given us here. It's what brought people here. They came. So what is it that makes us free? By the way, I'm going to get into the word for these next 10 minutes and close. The Bible is what leads us to freedom. This foundational documents that we've been talking about, this whole idea, what made it work wasn't because people had an idea for a political system. It was that they were Christian people and they built it on the Bible. They built it on the foundation of God and godliness. John 8:32, Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." This is a well-known quote from the Bible. The words of Jesus. And this has always been true. If you'll look at the map, study a map of the world and see where the Bible has gone, bringing freedom. The amazing timetable of God, if you look at the foundation, the founding of America. People came seeking religious freedom. They came to this country seeking to worship. The Puritans came, the Pilgrims, they were Puritans, seeking Bible-based freedom. And the printing press was invented in the 1400s. The first thing they began to print was Bibles. Lots of Bibles. Martin Luther, born in 1483, brought a lot of freedom. Freedom to worship based on the Bible. Bible-based freedom. He looked to the Bible and he found that the oppressive state, similar to what I'm talking about today, there was a church, the whole Catholic Church at the time was doing a lot of evil. They were trying to sell salvation, and men were collecting power in the name of God. But they weren't doing that because the foundation was bad. The foundation you'll find in the Bible. The foundation is Jesus. They were doing it because they wavered and they drifted from the foundation. And Martin Luther, he looked back to that Bible where he found that the just shall live by faith. And it was pointing men back to that foundation that brought them freedom. The Reformation. And it also brought some persecution. And this United States, this land provided a place for people to flee for freedom from that persecution. They came for freedom to follow the teachings of the Bible. They came to found a nation based on those biblical principles. And now throughout the world, you'll largely find that the nations that were founded based on Christian principles are the free nations. Freer. They're the nations where people still have a great deal of freedom and aren't run over by tanks in the middle of the street just for protesting something. You'll not find that under Sharia law. You won't find it under that system that they have over in China or Russia. This idea that you should love your enemies, that you should do good even to those that hate you, it allows for the freedom of thought and actions. And this is from the Bible. It's a radical concept that Jesus brought. It's Jesus that makes us really free. John 8:36, Jesus said, "Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed." You know, freedom flows from this written word and from the living word. Christ is the living word, and he's the one that sets people truly free. And Jesus was speaking, he was speaking more than just political freedom, more than just personal freedom here. A lot of times when we think of freedom, we think of being free to do whatever it is we want to do. That's what most people think. If I'm free, I can do anything I want. But a lot of people who've taken advantage of that kind of freedom have found that it has led actually to the opposite. Jesus knew that people doing whatever their sinful hearts wants often leads to the opposite of freedom. It leads to slavery. He said, whoever sins is a slave to sin. And the slave doesn't get to abide forever. Oh, how obvious that is to people who've suffered from addictions or alcoholism or lusts. It's very obvious there. It's easy to point out how the freedom to do this drug or drink that. I know I had some years where I drank an unbelievable amount of alcohol. And I remember I was free when it started. And then I can remember a few years down the road as I'd look at that bottle and say, I can't believe what's happening to me. I've got to stop this. And then I'd finish it off and start another one. Because what I thought was freedom wasn't. Jesus said, whoever sins is a slave to sin. It's obvious in matters like that, but it doesn't stop there. Many people live in the prisons of unforgiveness. Prisons, slaves to bitterness and strife. Some people live in prisons of greed, so that even when they have prosperity in their hands, they cannot enjoy it and be free. Other people live in prisons of fear and doubt and idolatry. and so many other sins that can dominate a person's life, character, and thoughts. Jesus, John 8:34 through 36, said, "Most assuredly, I say to you that whoever commits sin is a slave of sin. And a slave does not abide in the house forever, but a son abides forever. Therefore, if the Son makes you free, you shall be free indeed." Nicodemus was a man who was in bondage. He was a great Jewish leader. He was a rabbi. He was respected. He was honored. He was probably quite wealthy. He had some power. But he was a slave, and he knew it. That's why he snuck and came to Jesus by night. He was prisoner of his own pride also. He didn't want anybody to see him. But he knew that he was a slave. He said, "Jesus, we know that you've come from God." And Jesus said, "Nicodemus, unless a man is born again, he can't even see the kingdom of heaven." Nicodemus got set free. He became free of his religious bondage as he entered into a relationship with Jesus and his salvation. There was a guy named Zacchaeus who had such a lust for money. Oh, such a lust for money. He was very, very wealthy. He was a short little guy. But he heard that Jesus was coming, and he knew that for all of his wealth and for all of his power and prominence, he was missing something. And then one day he wanted to be free. He may not even have known of what. And he climbed a tree just to see Jesus. And when he saw Jesus, remember Jesus said, "If the Son will make you free, ye shall be free." He said, "You know what? Today, this day, everybody that I've done wrong, I give it all back. I'll restore it 4 times. And I'm going to give away half my goods to the poor people," he said. And Jesus said, "Today, salvation has come to your house." That day he found freedom. He was free from his greed. He was free from his lust for money. There was a woman at the well who was caught up in sexual sin, immorality. She met this guy named Jesus one day. Said she'd had 5 husbands. And she wasn't even sleeping with her husband now. She's sleeping with somebody else. She just couldn't help herself, I guess, because she was a slave to this sin that kept wreaking havoc in her life. But she came to faith in Jesus that day, and she became free. Not free to sin, but free from sin, free from the bondage of sin, free from the power of sin. Spiritual freedom can be ours through faith in Jesus Christ. 2 Corinthians 3 says, "Now the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty." Man's long search for God through religious ceremony. Over thousands of years, people were searching. We knew we needed, as a people, as humankind, we knew that we needed something. That's why all of the false religions have been founded. Hinduism and Buddhism and Islamism and all of those idolatrous spirit worship religions of the sun and the moon and the planets and the Greek gods and the Roman gods and all the things that we were talking about, the Aztecs and the other Indians, that they would sacrifice even their own loved ones. It's all rooted in the fact that men know that we're slaves to something we can't control, and we want to be free from it. We want to be in harmony with God because there's a God-shaped hole inside of every person. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's liberty from that. Christ came to free us from having to try to find God through a bunch of rules and laws that could never make men free. He said if there was a law that could have given life, then fine, but there wasn't. We must guard against reverting back to legalism. The fruit of the Spirit demonstrates whether you're free or not. By the way, you want to know whether you're free or not? Look to Galatians chapter 5. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faith, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. Political freedom can make us free citizens, but spiritual freedom makes us free saints. The only freedom that abides forever. So how free are you? We live in this free country, but are you free? Are we free from sin and doubt? Are we free in Christ today? If not, I want to invite you to receive him with a simple prayer.